Your show was, I believe, the first to push or bring to light David Betz, Professor of War in the Modern World at King's College London, and you had a viral episode about the idea of civil war in Britain, or coming to Britain. I wondered whether you were convinced by his arguments that civil war is actually possible in Britain.
Yes. So the reason that I first started talking to David was after last summer's riots, after the Southport riots, and I Googled, has anyone in academia been writing about the risk of civil war in Britain? And my memory from having previously read about, because the thing that people have talked about more often and for longer is civil war in America. And I remember there was a podcast series some years ago about this possibility, which I reviewed, and I read some of the literature at the time. And the main argument that is given as to why civil war is not a risk in a country like Britain, or indeed a country like America, is that we're too old. And typically that kind of conflict happens in young societies.
We were already pretty old when we had our first civil war.
Oh, I don't mean in terms of the length of the country. I mean in terms of the population. So the average age of the population is too old. So I emailed David and basically said to you, what do you think about that argument? Because people are always saying this, and maybe in a complacent way. And I wondered if it might act as sort of a buffer, the fact that, I think the average person in this country is in their early 40s now, which is old relative to Britain of the, at the time of the First English Civil War, we were a much younger country. But at the time of the First English Civil War, we were also a country of like 5 million people. It was very much, much smaller than we are now. And therefore the absolute number of young men, obviously it's young men who actually wage these conflicts. Absolute number of young men is much larger now than it was in the 17th century. Does that not maybe suggest, I asked David, does that not suggest that we are vulnerable to this? And he said yes. And also as he's related on my show and elsewhere, a lot of what we're seeing, it can be, it may be a mistake to rely too much on historical analogy, because the precise conditions that we're experiencing now have never been experienced before. Like ever. And so it's just inherently unpredictable.
The one obvious difference is that at that time, the population was armed. And this time, only the state has arms. So it's kind of hard to imagine. As we saw last summer and we continue to see, there's definite rioting and protests that are possible, but that to go from that to actual civil war seems like a ginormous leap that I can't actually fathom. Maybe you can, if you actually believe it, you can paint me that picture. If people aren't armed, how exactly are they going to wage war?
Well, I suppose it depends on the model of warfare that you're imagining. So sort of the pitched battles, American Civil War style, no. What David has mapped out as a plausible route by which this might happen is more to do with infrastructure attacks by guerrilla groups who don't need weapons. You can get a long way with cars, for instance, or basic tools to sabotage, say, electricity systems or gas networks or whatever it might be. And the model that he and I were both noticed before we first spoke is the Blade Runners who have been sabotaging ULEZ cameras. And that's another example of ex-Cockneys in operation. Blade Runners are ex-Cockneys. They live outside London and they commute in often as tradies to work in the capital, and they resent having to pay the ULEZ fees for their...
Too right.
Yeah, say they've got diesel vans, which they need for work, right?
Because their business is a precarious business to run anyway.
Yeah, so and also they have an existing resentment against City Khan and against the way that London's been governed. And
righteous resentment, I'd say.
And so they sabotage the cameras in order to avoid... And they've got away with it, but they've done a really good job of sabotaging this infrastructure and not being caught. You can imagine that scaled up You don't need guns to do any of that. So it's plausible that people could certainly cause a lot of disruption without needing guns. This isn't unique to Britain. I think maybe Britain is a bit ahead. The only other country that I think is similarly at risk of this kind of escalation is probably France. But there are other countries which are experiencing pretty much exactly the same phenomena in terms of very high levels of immigration being resisted by the native working class. And this hasn't happened before. There's no direct historical analogy that we could look to for guidance.
We're much closer to something like the Lebanese civil war, but again, there's so many dissimilarities that it's perhaps not even useful.
Or the Troubles is maybe... I think in some ways the use of the term civil war is misleading because it makes people think of the English Civil War or the American Civil War. The Troubles might be a better kind of sub-level of... death and disorder.
So who are the sides? Who are the belligerents in this upcoming conflict?
If it is upcoming, I don't know.
I'm not totally convinced, but yeah.
The other view is that, I think obviously that we ought to take David's predictions extremely seriously, but the other view is that we're going to just see more of the same, but at a slower pace. There'll never be a great event. There'll never be this, a sudden escalation. You'll just see, we're already seeing quite significant civil disruption in terms of rioting. This summer we've not seen rioting on the scale that we saw last summer, but we have seen the widespread migrant hotel protests. We've seen the flagging phenomenon, which I think is indicative of increased sectarian tension.
Raise the colours and...
Yeah. And we've also seen there was an attack in Stevenage there was a petrol bomb thrown at men who were flagging.
Oh, I missed that.
Did you? Yeah, so there were some men who were out raising St George's crosses, and someone threw a petrol bomb at one of them, hit him in the face and hurt him quite badly. These are small, and there's been a little bit of rioting at Epping, and there's all this stuff is small scale, massively, but I think it does indicate a level of tension which was not there, say, 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
That's absolutely the case.
So it's already the case, I think, that Britain is in a bad way.
But sorry, the tension is between whom?
Well, I think the primary tension is actually between, as you've argued, there's no war but the class war.
Yes.
Yeah. The primary tension is between, and a lot of this, has so much to do with your relationship to, it's not just centuries-long class tensions. It's also your relationship to the globalized economy. If you suffer economically from the mass importation of cheap labor, you vote Trump.
Yeah.
Right? It's bad for you when that happens. Whereas if you benefit from importing cheap labor, then you obviously have a completely different perspective on this.
I think your argument's been well made on the tension between the, let's say, indigenous classes of Britain.
Yeah.
But the fact is that in the riots and the examples that you're bringing up over the last 18 months, it has been between white working classes and newcomers. And we've seen sort of some of the counter-protests after Southport were Muslim groups chanting Allah Akbar. Even before Southport, there were Muslim groups after the Manchester arrest, if you remember that thing at Manchester Airport, where I guess a local, clearly an immigrant background, I'm not sure which one, there's a video they released in different stages, and it seemed like he was being mistreated, but then when you see the whole video you realise he was the one actually instigating the violence. And then you have outside of police police station, a whole group of Muslims going Allah Akbar, chanting and throwing rocks at the police station. So it's the case that there are Muslim groups, there are white working class groups. Is this where the tension's actually going to play out in the more kinetic version of the conflict?
Presumably, yes. Although it wouldn't stay confined to that, because there are also existing tensions between different ethnic minorities, say between Indian and Pakistani groups, which have in Leicester, for instance, have already caused violence. you see this fairly frequently in London, that you'll have some event happens on the other side of the world and it provokes violence in London between different groups who have different opinions on what's happened. So it is an inherently unstable situation when you have sort of hyper-diversity,
Yes.
which we have now, and which is really historically unprecedented, like really is. And I think that this is a whole thread within political discourse in this country, which just drives me insane, that the level of the sort of deliberate obtuseness of many people in media about how unprecedented our ethnic diversity is now. And people will play dumb all the time about, oh, but what even is English? Whatever. I mean, it so much reminds me of transgenderism, the debate over, but what even is a woman? But what if someone's had, XYZ procedure done? Are they still a woman? It's like, look. These things have fuzzy boundaries, right? I mean, less so with men and women, actually, the boundaries are fairly clear. But, there are intersex people. There are people who have made themselves intersex through surgery. There are people who often get mistaken for the opposite sex. Of course, there are fuzzy boundaries. Femininity and masculinity don't exactly map onto maleness and femaleness. But obviously the categories are real. And obviously when anyone is trying to tell you that the categories aren't real, despite the evidence of your own eyes, they're doing it because they have a political project in mind.
Yes.
Okay. And I think that we see the same thing when it comes to ethnicity and nationality. I just think it's absurd to say, like, Englishness doesn't exist as a category. Obviously, it has fuzzy boundaries. Obviously, people have always been intermarrying with neighbouring groups, and there have been waves of immigration. I mean, like, harshly resisted. The idea that the Normans or the Vikings arrived as like happy immigrants is obviously ridiculous. Those are invading armies. But the idea that any ethnic group is completely pure and has absolutely no relationship to any other is obviously absurd. That applies to every group, though. Why is it only this one, which we're constantly hearing, doesn't actually exist?
Yes. We hear about ethnic minorities in that term quite regularly, but the implication, of course, is that there is an ethnic majority, and which we seem to deny that exists completely.
And I mean, I'm not arguing, like, making a hard case for ethno-nationalism. I'm saying, like, can we please just have some honesty about the reality that we're dealing with, which is actually that the various ethnic groups that make up the British Isles have been unusually stable compared with other countries. We've had pretty much 1,000 years of being very stable up until maybe the 1950s, where you're talking 99% plus. Okay. And obviously there's always been small numbers of people coming over for various reasons, and there's been more or less happy intermingling. That kind of, there's so much Motte and Bailey that goes on in this argumentation, that people will go from saying the existence of, say, the Huguenots in 18th century London, which is uncontested, therefore means that London has always looked as it does now, which is just stupid. It drives me crazy. It's just a dishonesty. And again, it reminds me so much of trans debate. This dishonesty and smart people pretending that they don't understand basic things. Because either they're trying not to get in trouble with people on their political side, or because they're trying to push a political project.
Thanks for watching this clip from The Winston Marshall Show. You can click here to watch the full episode, and for more clips like this one, don't forget to subscribe. And as always, be well.